Jim Carrey once stood on stage as the highest-paid comedian on the planet, and now, at 64 years old, he has quietly confirmed what fans feared for years. His story is finally coming to an end, and the way he chose to say goodbye tells you everything about the man behind the mask. For decades, Jim Carrey was the loudest voice in every room he walked into. He twisted his face into shapes no other actor dared to try. He threw his body across rooms for a laugh, and he built a career out of never holding back. But in April of 2022, something changed. While promoting Sonic the Hedgehog 2, a reporter asked him a simple question about his future, and instead of joking his way past the way he always had, Jim gave a real answer. He said he had done enough. He said he was fairly serious about stepping away from acting for good. For a man who had spent 40 years chasing the next laugh, the next role, the next reason to keep performing, those words landed like an earthquake across Hollywood. At first, almost no one believed him. Actors say they are retiring all the time, and most of them are back on a movie set within a year. But Jim Carrey was different, and the fans who had followed him since his days doing impressions in a small Ontario comedy club knew it. This was not a man chasing headlines. This was a man who had spent his entire life performing through pain, and who finally sounded tired of pretending everything was fine. To understand why Jim Carrey's goodbye means so much, you have to go back to where it all started. He was born in 1962 in a small town outside Toronto, the youngest of 4 children in a home where money was always tight. His father, Percy, had once played saxophone in a jazz band before giving up his dream to become an accountant, just to keep food on the table. When Jim was a teenager, his father lost that job too, and the family spiraled into poverty so severe that they ended up living out of a van parked near a lake, with Jim and his brother sleeping in a tent beside it through freezing Canadian winters. Every morning, they woke up with frost on their sleeping bags and washed up at a gas station before school. And some nights Jim pulled expired sandwiches out of the trash just to have something warm to eat. Jim worked night shifts scrubbing floors in a factory as a teenager, then came home exhausted to help take care of his mother, who was often too sick to get out of bed. He bathed her, cooked for her, and sat beside her telling jokes just to see her smile for a moment. In the middle of all that suffering, comedy was the only thing that gave him any relief. Making his mother laugh, even for a few seconds, felt like the most important job in the world. Even as a young boy, before any of the fame arrived, Jim was already practicing the skill that would define his entire life. He spent hours in front of a mirror as a child, twisting his face into strange shapes just to see what expressions he could create. At school, teachers grew frustrated with him for constantly turning lessons into performances, and he was thrown out of class more than once for impersonating whoever happened to be standing nearby. Other kids gave him a nickname because of how easily his face could stretch and bend, and while some meant it as an insult, Jim wore it like a badge of honor. For a boy with almost nothing, making people laugh was the one thing that always belonged to him. That early pain never fully left him, and Jim has said so many times over the years. He has talked openly about carrying a kind of sadness that never completely goes away, one that he treated with medication starting all the way back in the 1980s. Being funny on camera and feeling steady off camera were 2 very different things for him, and the older he got, the more he seemed to want people to understand that difference. He has often described it as wearing a mask that had nothing to do with makeup or costumes, a mask of someone smiling on the outside while quietly struggling underneath. And he has said that mask became heavier the longer his career went on. His climb to fame was fast and brutal at the same time. He got rejected by Saturday Night Live not once, not twice, but 3 separate times across 3 different years. Each time, he took the rejection, reworked his approach, and came back with something stranger and bolder than before. That stubbornness eventually paid off when he joined the sketch show In Living Color in 1990. Where his wild characters made him impossible to ignore. From there, everything exploded. Ace Ventura: Pet Detective turned him into a movie star almost overnight. The Mask proved he could carry a visual spectacle, and Dumb and Dumber cemented him as one of the funniest men alive. All 3 of those films came out within the same 12 months, a stretch of success so rare that few actors in history have ever matched it. By the mid-1990s, Jim Carrey was earning more per movie than almost anyone in the industry, and studios were fighting each other just to get him attached to a script. But the higher he climbed, the harder the private side of his life seemed to shake. His first marriage ended while he was working nearly around the clock filming sketch after sketch. His second marriage lasted barely a year. Behind the enormous paychecks and the sold-out theaters, Jim later admitted that fame never gave him the peace he thought it would. He has said in more than one interview over the years that he wished everyone could become rich and famous just once, so they could see for themselves that it does not actually solve anything inside a person. He has also spoken about the exhaustion of always being expected to be the funniest person in every room, saying that people rarely stopped to ask how he was actually feeling once the cameras stopped rolling. Then came the films that changed how people saw him completely. The Truman Show in 1998 showed audiences a different Jim Carrey, one who could hold total silence in a room instead of filling it with noise. Playing a man who slowly discovers his entire life has been a performance for other people's entertainment hit strangely close to home for an actor who had spent his whole career performing to survive. A year later, he transformed himself for Man on the Moon, losing weight and staying in character even when the cameras stopped rolling, chasing a kind of truth in acting that went far beyond simply being funny. These films earned him serious respect and 2 Golden Globe Awards, even though the Academy Award that so many people expected him to win never came. Many critics have said over the years that this snub remains one of the strangest oversights in modern film history, and Jim himself has occasionally joked about it, though those close to him say the omission quietly bothered him more than he ever let on publicly. Somewhere in the middle of all this success, Jim started searching for something outside of Hollywood entirely. He began reading about mindfulness and meditation, studying teachers who talked about letting go of ego and finding peace outside of achievement. In 2017, during an interview at a fashion event, he told reporters that he no longer felt like a separate individual chasing personal glory, that he felt connected to something much bigger than himself. People online mocked him for it at the time, joking that fame had made him lose his mind. But looking back now, it reads less like confusion and more like a man quietly preparing to walk away from the life everyone else thought he wanted. Around this same period, Jim began spending long stretches of time painting, filling canvas after canvas with images inspired by his own reflections on faith and forgiveness, work that had nothing to do with box office numbers or movie contracts. He once told an audience of people rebuilding their lives after hard times that forgiving others is one of the most powerful things a person can ever learn to do, and he said he believed that lesson applied just as much to forgiving yourself. That same year, in 2017, Jim faced a health scare that few fans ever heard much about. While filming Sonic the Hedgehog 2 years later, he battled a serious case of pneumonia that left him weak and forced him to stop and think seriously about how much longer he wanted to keep pushing his body through demanding film shoots. It was not the kind of headline that trended for days, but for Jim, it was another quiet reminder that the version of himself who used to work 80-hour weeks without stopping could not keep going forever. The signs kept building through the 2010s. His daughter Jane was diagnosed with autism in 2012, and their relationship grew more distant over the years that followed, with Jane publicly disagreeing with some of her father's views. In 2015, Jim's on-again, off-again girlfriend passed away, a loss that led to painful legal battles and headlines that followed him for years afterward. Around the same time, he pulled out of promoting one of his own films after a mass shooting at an elementary school, saying plainly that he could not in good conscience support something built around violence while real families were grieving. Piece by piece, the man who once threw himself across a movie set for a laugh was choosing silence over the spotlight more and more often. By 2018, Jim was already dropping hints that his acting career was winding down. He spent more time painting than filming, creating hundreds of pieces inspired by his own spiritual reflections rather than any movie role. When he finally returned to the screen in 2020 as Dr. Robotnik in Sonic the Hedgehog, he joked to the press that he had only come back because he needed the money after buying too many houses. It got a laugh, the way almost everything he says does, but underneath the joke was something more honest. he was admitting that even his comeback was not really about chasing fame again. Then, in 2022 came the announcement that changed everything. Speaking to Access Hollywood while promoting Sonic the Hedgehog 2, Jim said he was fairly serious about retiring from acting, adding that he felt he had truly done enough. For a career built on a man who never seemed to know when to stop. Hearing him say he had reached his limit felt like the end of an era. Fans scrolled through old clips of Ace Ventura and The Mask, wondering if they had just watched his very last movie, without even knowing it. Except that is not quite how the story ended. 2 years later, in 2024, Jim Carrey returned once more to reprise Dr. Robotnik in Sonic the Hedgehog 3. When reporters asked how a man who had already announced his retirement was suddenly back on a movie set, Jim laughed and said you could never be completely certain about these things, joking that what he had really meant was more like taking long rests rather than fully quitting forever. He admitted the story about needing a perfect script printed in gold ink to lure him back was not just a joke either. The filmmakers actually did something close to that to convince him. And Jim said gestures like that were part of what made him feel like doing it again. Even after that return, though, the pattern kept repeating itself. Jim stayed almost completely out of the public eye through most of 2025, appearing only once that year in November, when he was honored at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ceremony in Los Angeles. It was a rare sighting for a man who used to be everywhere, and fans noticed. Then, in February of this year, Jim Carrey made his first public appearance of 2026, stepping onto the stage in Paris to accept an honorary César award, one of French cinema's highest honors. He arrived with his hair grown out past his shoulders, a striking new look that immediately caught everyone's attention. Photos from the ceremony spread quickly online, with many people saying he looked almost unrecognizable compared to the wild, rubber-faced comedian they remembered from the 90s. Speculation started almost instantly about what had changed in his appearance, though neither Jim nor his team ever directly addressed those rumors. The head of the French Academy brushed the chatter aside, insisting it was simply not worth discussing, and instead choosing to focus on celebrating what he called one of the most original and daring voices modern cinema had ever produced. The director Michel Gondry, who had worked closely with Jim on Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind more than 20 years earlier, personally introduced him that night, a reunion that felt fitting for a man being celebrated for a career built on reinvention. What made that night in Paris so powerful was not the award itself, but the speech that came with it. Jim spoke in French, honoring his own family roots, and turned emotional when he brought up his father Percy, the man who once sacrificed his own musical dreams just to keep his family afloat. Jim called his father the funniest man he had ever known, and said Percy was the one who first taught him about love, generosity, and laughter. He shared a lesson his father used to repeat to him, that if you want life to smile back at you, you have to be willing to smile at it first, even when that is the hardest thing in the world to do. Jim admitted that lesson still is not easy, but said he thinks of his father and smiles every time he remembers it. For a man who spent his childhood watching his father clean bathrooms in the very factory where he used to work as an accountant, that moment in Paris was not just an award ceremony. It was a son finally standing in front of the world to say thank you to the man who shaped everything about him, decades after that man was gone. Since that appearance, Jim has gone quiet again, giving no indication of any upcoming film or project. Reports have described his life now as noticeably slower and more private than at any other point in his career, a stretch some have called the quiet closing chapter of one of Hollywood's most explosive careers. He has said before that he values staying out of people's faces, explaining that while some people want constant attention, he prefers giving people the chance to miss him instead. For a man who once could not stop performing even when he was falling apart inside, choosing quiet on purpose might be the most honest performance of his entire life. Fans who grew up watching Ace Ventura and The Mask on repeat now find themselves in an unusual position, holding onto a childhood built around a man who no longer wants to be watched every day. Comment sections under his old clips have filled with people thanking him for the laughter he gave them during hard times in their own lives, while also wishing him peace now that he has decided to step back. It is rare for a comedian this beloved to be allowed to simply disappear on his own terms, But Jim seems to have earned that quiet exit through everything he gave audiences for over 4 decades. Looking at everything Jim Carrey has said and done over the last few years, it is hard not to see the full picture forming. A boy who once made his sick mother laugh just to survive another day grew into a man who made the entire world laugh, sometimes while hiding real pain behind every joke. He chased fame, found more of it than almost anyone in history, and then spent his later years trying to explain that it never once gave him the peace he thought it would. He tried walking away in 2022, came back one more time in 2024, and has spent the time since mostly out of the spotlight, showing up only for moments that clearly mattered to him personally, like honoring his father's memory in front of the world. Whether Jim Carrey ever steps in front of a camera again or not, the story he has been quietly telling through his actions over the past few years feels like a man making peace with his own ending on his own terms. Not with another blockbuster, not with another outrageous character, but with silence, family, and gratitude. After a lifetime spent making other people laugh, so he would not have to feel his own pain, Jim Carrey may finally be choosing something different for whatever chapter comes next. One built simply on being at peace with himself.